way because, as you will see, the panel is slightly different. It's an unusual panel. It's a panel of Americans trying to reflect on a very difficult moment of humanity as a whole. But this reflection is part of the prayer for peace as a gift or as a possibility that is also created by a new element, a new reality of the community of Sant'Egidio, that is the Sant'Egidio Foundation for Peace and Dialogue. It's a new entity that Marco Impagliazzo, the president of the community of Sant'Egidio, decided to launch 3 years ago in New York. It's an American foundation, it's an American entity. This is why I'm speaking English. Potrei parlare anche italiano, sono nato a Roma. But now I'm living in the US and I feel that it's important for us to speak English as a way to try to think in English, in the hope to understand better, more deeply, the complicated and very dangerous pathways that led in the Cuban crisis everybody very close to annihilation. I think that we should learn to speak Russian as well. It's a language that I do not speak, but Adriano Roccucci, the other speaker that will come here from the community of Sant'Egidio, does speak. As he speaks Ukrainian, together with the sisters and brothers of the community of Sant'Egidio that live in Ukraine and Russia. And I would like everybody to appreciate that Sant'Egidio is an unusual actor when we speak about peace, because in more than 70 countries around the world, you have sisters and brothers of Sant'Egidio. When there is a military attack in the north of Mozambique, Sant'Egidio sisters and brothers are there. When you have difficulties in Burkina Faso, Sant'Egidio brothers and sisters are there. And even in the US, there is a small community of Sant'Egidio in New York, in Boston, in Washington, in many different places. So I would like everybody to appreciate how this Sant'Egidio Foundation for Peace and Dialogue, we can scroll this a little bit more so that we can see the 4 elements. Of course, depart from evil and do good, seek peace and pursue it is the invitation of Psalm 31st. And seeking what unites is the invitation of John the 23rd. This Pope that played a very important role in the crisis in Cuba and invited everybody to participate in this effort to reorient humanity. I am tempted to come down and ask Philippe, who is our brothers from Burkina Faso, to share a story with us, a very small story that just happened a few weeks ago, linking New York and Burkina Faso.
I don't know if to say it in English or in Italian, because you force us to speak English.
No, you can try in Italian, we have okay. The translations.
Right. Ciò che volevo dire è solo 2 parole su ciò che è successo a New York il 28 agosto di quest'anno. Per il Burkina Faso, brevemente, è un paese di 21 milioni di abitanti, collocati nell'Africa occidentale. che da qualche anno soffre del terrorismo. Era un sono preda dei terroristi. Allora, fare una manifestazione radunando tutte le varie realtà religiose in un paese lontano come gli Stati Uniti ha una incidenza in loco, perché c'è il diritto alla pace, il diritto di vivere insieme. E quando il 28 agosto è stata fatta questa manifestazione, in Burkina, quando io ne ho parlato, perché noi siamo su una parrocchia insieme agli amici della comunità di Sant'Egidio, c'è stata una manifestazione a New York per la pace in Burkina Faso. Hanno detto, davvero? Ma proprio a New York ho detto, vedete, diamoci da fare. Se da lontano si pensa al nostro paese, diamoci da fare e pensiamo a altri paesi come l'Ucraina, che soffre, ma non diciamo è lontano. Così si diceva quando i terroristi non erano ancora venuti in Burkina, che era solo il Mali. Così si diceva quando la pandemia iniziava, il virus in Cina, è lontano, non è in Europa. E dall'Africa si diceva no, è solo in Europa. E poi il virus è arrivato anche in Africa. Siamo uniti, siamo collegati. E se il male può distruggere, il bene che si fa anche lontano può contagiare. Perché i burkinabè che vivono a New York, più di 10.000 se non mi sbaglio, hanno dei parenti, degli amici, sono di tutte le religioni, di tutte le etnie. I beni ricevuti dalla comunità a New York può avere un impatto positivo laggiù, perché non siamo slegati, E quindi io credo che questa breve testimonianza su ciò che è successo a New York sono da moltiplicare, perché questo è anche ciò di cui si è parlato in questi giorni, l'immaginazione alternativa. Sempre immaginare qualcosa di alternativa che possa portare bene al nostro mondo, perché abbiamo un destino comune e non possiamo vivere separati. Grazie.
What I found remarkable about this story that I just learned yesterday at dinner here. I knew of the event that happened in New York, but I didn't know that there was this effect in Burkina Faso, right? And the learning comes from the friendship of Sant'Egidio, this connection, this being together. And the vision becomes a gift shared from one another. And to all the young people here, I just would like to remind everybody that Andrea Riccardi, the person that started Sant'Egidio, was 18. I repeat, he was 18 when he started the community. It's very important for us to realize that whatever you can see now is actually the long practice, the daily practice of listening to a voice of the Spirit speaking to a community and then making history day by day. I can see Dr. Mauro Garofalo, that I hope will come here to explain painting. I hope that the technician will be able to show this painting, because it's another gift, this time coming from Rome to the US. In New York, for the first time in August 6 to 9, we had a vigil to remember the first bombing, the only bombing, nuclear bombing that ever happened against Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And in that occasion, the community gathered in prayer, and gathered many who came together as the community does regularly, every month, all over the world. But from Rome, unexpectedly, we had a gift, the gift of an image that we would like to show to everybody, because it's part of another tradition that Sant'Egidio started, the Laboratorio d'Arte degli Amici.
Well, this is obviously, it reminds us of what remained of Hiroshima after the bombing, the nuclear bombing at the end of the Second World War. And this is actually the fruit of graphic and painting reflection of our artists with disabilities. You have to know that there is an artistic movement of contemporary art that is carried on with different laboratories. This is the fruit of the laboratory of Trastevere, and there is a deep connection between the work of peace and the art we are doing in this laboratory. So we thought to underline the importance of the commemoration of this awful event, this bombing of Hiroshima. We thought to translate into art what happened. But this is, of course, a memory of the terrible event. It is also a message of hope. You see the cherry tree with a pictogram in Japanese that means peace. So even despite the tragedy of the nuclear bombing, the first nuclear bombing, you still have a hope for peace and for something to blossom. And that's it.
Thank you. I was mentioning before Adriano Roccucci as one of the speakers that will speak today, mentioning also the community of Sant'Egidio in Ukraine and Russia. I was explaining that this panel is a little unusual because it's an American panel with an Italian speaker. But it's an Italian speaker that actually speaks Russian and Ukrainian. So
everybody can understand.
And so in that sense, I just wanted to invite a word to help us in a way locate the panel in this effort of Sant'Egidio that is so present in Ukraine, so present in Russia, seeking ways, seeking words in this difficult moment.
Do you suggest to speak in English or in Italian?
Italian va benissimo, c'è la traduzione, possiamo
Okay.
parlare in italiano.
And maybe a lot of the people is Italian speaking, I don't know. Ma sì, Sant'Egidio, come forse molti sanno, è presente in Ucraina in maniera molto radicata da tanti anni, da 30 anni, con una presenza di vicinanza ai poveri, che è stata vicinanza ai senza dimora delle grandi città, a Kiev, a Kharkiv, che è la seconda città del paese, ma anche a Leopoli, Ivano-Frankivsk, con una vicinanza agli anziani, che sono quella parte della popolazione che nei paesi ex sovietici hanno sofferto di più dal passaggio della società da quella società sovietica alle società che sono venute a formarsi e sono ancora in corso di formazione dal 1991 in poi. Vicinanza ai minori, ai tanti bambini che nelle scuole della pace, nei programmi di adozione a distanza abbiamo accompagnato in questi decenni, sia nel far fronte ai bisogni. Ricordo che a cavallo del nuovo secolo in Ucraina vi erano centinaia di migliaia di bambini di strada, i quali per fortuna, anche grazie ad alcune politiche sagge, sono stati, è un fenomeno che è stato ricondotto a una, diciamo, una realtà non così tragica e drammatica anche dal punto di vista quantitativo, ma anche una generazioni che Sant'Egidio in Ucraina ha formato a una cultura di pace, che è stata una cultura che ha voluto innanzitutto guardare ai più poveri, ai più bisognosi, una cultura che ha voluto contrastare fenomeni come l'antisemitismo, l'antigitanismo o altre forme di razzismo, una cultura che ha aperto a uno sguardo mondiale dall'Ucraina, non sempre facile da avere, una cultura che ha voluto motivare a una scelta non violenta, pacifica, e poi anche altri impegni. Ecco, tutto questo è stato, come dire, si è scontrato con la guerra con le sue lacerazioni, con i suoi drammi. Ieri Olga Makar nell'assemblea di apertura ha spiegato molti aspetti, ha ricordato come una delle sedi, la sede del Movimento dei Giovani per la Pace a Kiev, è stata colpita durante un attacco missilistico. Quindi c'è stato un impatto della guerra molto diretto sulla vita della comunità, sulla vita dei poveri, sulla vita delle città in cui le comunità sono presenti, ma c'è stato, come appunto diceva ieri Olia, una risposta che è stata provare a ripristinare la pace violata, cuore a cuore, persona a persona, con anche qui con quello che è la caratteristica dello spirito di Sant'Egidio, e quindi un'attenzione privilegiata ai più deboli, ai più poveri. Faccio solo un esempio, ti do la parola, che è quello dell'evacuazione di più di 125, mi pare adesso sono arrivati a 128 malati che hanno necessità di dialisi e che sono venuti in Europa per poterla continuare senza rischiare di mettere a rischio la loro vita per l'assenza di capacità di continuare le cure. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We can go together. Adriano, Jeff, please. And Jeff, please. Very good. It's delightful to be here. I think that we can now see if all the connections to our friends around the world will work and connect that way. As moderator, as the facilitator of this panel, we can see Kerry Kennedy. Hello, nice to see you. Welcome to Rome. You are joining a very full room. I don't know if you can see us. We can certainly see you. We are delighted to see you. And you are speaking from?
Hyannisport, Massachusetts.
Very good. Wonderful. So for you, it's around 11 o'clock, right?
Exactly.
Very good. Fantastic. We are delighted to be together. It's good that technology helps us to be connected this way. But we are honestly very happy that we are also connected in person. There is something about being in person that is really remarkable. We saw it yesterday when President Macron was speaking and was referring to Andrea Riccardi very vividly. No, we were in a conversation. It was very clear that the conversation in person was springing, was allowing different kind of things. We hope that this panel will be as interactive as we can be. For those who are interested we will have certainly room and possibility for those who are joining here to do questions, to do observation with the speakers through the microphones here. If there are those online, the panel is also shared online. They will be able to join, to connect with us through the email SFPD, Sant'Egidio Foundation for Peace and Dialogue, @sant'egidio.org. You can send your questions, your comments, and we will do our best to take care of you and respond to your questions. We should have 2 more speakers. I can only see 1 at the moment. One from, oh, here we are, fantastic. Martin, nice to see you. You are in California, right?
Correct. I'm at Stanford University near San Francisco, and thank you for having me.
We are delighted to have you, and if I understand correctly, it's 8 o'clock for you.
Yes.
Very good. We are delighted that you are connected. Thank you for waking up early and be with us, and we are definitely delighted to be together. Is Peter already connected, or let's see if we are waiting for the last speakers, but we are delighted that this is already happening. So we are definitely making good progress in this hybrid. As I was mentioning at the beginning, this is in the informal conversation that we were having before. This is a panel that actually came to us as a gift of Jeffrey Sachs, that in a way suggested and invited a conversation, and is a very American conversation, right? We hope that maybe in the future, in other occasions of the prayer for peace, other voices, other languages, other contributions will also be shared around this concern of the nuclear risk, right? But I do share with Jeff and the speakers here these concerns from the American side. It's a very important American concern, not only because America is the only country that used nuclear weapons, but also because, of course, has used nuclear weapons to deter. And the risk that we are facing now is a change in positioning, where nuclear weapons are not used only, or the use of nuclear weapons is not conceivable only as a deterrence, but also as last resort. You know, if we look at different ways of considering the options. I would like just to make sure that Peter Kuznick is with us, because I asked him to be the first actually to open the panel. Peter and
Peter's on now.
fantastic. We were speaking about Peter, and Peter appears. Fantastic. So we are delighted that this is the case. So we are all together, and we can officially start. So let's give us each other a round of applause as welcome to. So as I said, welcome to all of you who are here in person. Welcome to all of you who are joining online. This is an unusual panel for the Prayer for Peace. In the first 36 years, we discussed many issues, but never addressed directly the nuclear threat. So we are grateful for this occasion to pay attention to this growing concern. Unfortunately, the nuclear risk is real. The possibility of an actual nuclear explosion after the tragic bombing against Hiroshima and Nagasaki is closer than at any other times before. We will address this risk through the lens of the Cuban crisis, the moment in history when the whole world was very close to a nuclear escalation. Can we learn from it? What did humanity learn from it? Is it possible that we are learning the wrong lesson and that we are actually moving closer to make the use of nuclear weapons almost expected? As I mentioned, I'm aware that this is a sort of an unbalanced panel of Americans, but one. But I would like to welcome all, Americans and non-Americans alike, to join in the concern of the nuclear risk. The current crisis in Ukraine created new conditions for nuclear risk. Already in February, President Putin ordered his nuclear forces into special combat readiness. What was the meaning of such a declaration? Around the nuclear risk, there is a significant paradox related to the secrecy and classification versus public display and threat. How could signals be decoded properly? Are the signals authentic? Are they intentionally misleading? What about the responses? Are there discrepancies between public and secret responses? What about the multiplicity of actors? As much as possible, we would like the panel to be the cultural exchange preparing and accompanying the relevant reorientation. Sant'Egidio has been seeking peace and pursuing it, following pragmatic pathways, opportunities for peace. In Mozambique first, then in Algeria, in Guatemala, in Kosovo, in many other places. More recently in Central African Republic, in South Sudan. Sant'Egidio has been listening attentively to the voices longing for peace, exploring peace, dreaming for peace, strengthening the options that could unite and making possible the peace that was emerging. Sant'Egidio has been involved in peacemaking according to a measure of the possible that could be amplified and exploring possibility for peace that were either removed or were constrained. Think of Mozambique 30 years ago. But Olia yesterday in the plenary asked, how do you prepare for a nuclear attack? And the student this morning in panel 1 asked, what about the nuclear risk? The nuclear threat is different. When we hear references to tactical nuclear weapons designed to be used in a battlefield, in military situation, we see intentionality. Yet when we witness the very open attack against the nuclear power plant in Ukraine, we observe almost playing with the dangers of errors. This growing concern around nuclear risk led Sant'Egidio to a renewed commitment to prayer and the organization of the first Vigil for Peace in New York City last August 6 to 9, in remembrance of the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. On that occasion, the Art Laboratory of the Amici produced the painting Hiroshima, Hiroshima Peace, that we can now see again projected for a moment. For you to see too. I'm sharing this image because I believe that one of the functions of this panel is truly to serve as a catalyst of an attention that is maintained over time and location, ideally involving all, to make sure that the nuclear weapons are never used and possibly abandoned. We all need to be more attentive, intelligent, reasonable, and responsible, one by one and together. Yesterday, Andrea Riccardi spoke of the need of alternative visions. That responsibility is shared by all of us. As I said today, we will focus on the Cuban crisis. Its protagonists, Nikita Kruschev, John Kennedy, Pope John XXIII, the risk of an escalation, the commitment to security and peace for all, the possibility of a nuclear accident, the need to learn for the present. We have prominent speakers. I invite all to read their bios in the program online. We will hear first from Peter Kuznick, American University, then Adriano Roccucci. First to share the historical background of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Then we will hear from Martin Hellman and Kerry Kennedy to deepen the reflection on risk and opportunities. Then we will have Jeffrey Sachs concluding the first part, and then we will open up to the audience and to people internationally that want to interact with the speakers. And then we will have a second round and close, hopefully in an hour and a half, an hour and 45 minutes. While the speakers are presenting, as I said, the public is invited to share comments and questions online through the email sfpd@sant'egidio.org. And I will do my best to connect them to a current conversation. I would like to remind everybody that the panel is recorded, and I'll give the floor to Peter Kuznick first. Peter, the floor is yours.
Peter needs to unmute.
Now I got it. Sorry. I started to say that I wanted to thank you for that introduction, which was right on the mark and raised the important issues, because we're at such a dangerous moment in history. We're facing still a pandemic, the global warming, environmental crisis, the economic crisis, food shortages, political instability, resurgence of right-wing governments, enormous gap between rich and poor, the richest 8 people in the world having more wealth than the poorest 4 billion. And then on top of that, as people have been saying, this is the closest we've come to nuclear war since the Cuban Missile Crisis. But there are some differences. And many who've compared the two crises have drawn the wrong lessons or stressed the wrong issues. So I'm going to try to set part of that record straight today. First, Robert Kennedy titled his rather self-serving memoir about the missile crisis, 13 Days. Those who adhere to this chronology start the clock ticking on October 16th, when McGeorge Bundy, the National Security Advisor, informed President Kennedy of the photographic proof that analysts had identified Soviet missiles in Cuba. And then for them, the crisis ends on October 28th, when Khrushchev announced that the missiles were being withdrawn from Cuba. The reality was that US nuclear forces remained on high alert until November 20th, when Russia pulled its nuclear-capable IL-28 bombers out of Cuba. Similarly, many date the Russian invasion of Ukraine today to February 24th, missing the backstory there too. The backstory about NATO expansion, the backstory about the warnings that Brzezinski, or the plans that Brzezinski and many of the neocons laid out for removing Ukraine from Russia's orbit in order to make sure that Russia never becomes a Eurasian power again. But I date the start of the Cuban Missile Crisis to October 4th, 1957, when the Soviets launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite to Earth, circle the Earth. They had also launched the first intercontinental ballistic missile on May 15th, 1957. The Democrats said that there was an enormous missile gap, that the United States was trailing well behind Russia in missiles. The Democrats used that to regain the White House in 1960. Kennedy stressed the U.S. vulnerability in defeating Richard Nixon narrowly in 1960, stressed the missile gap. One of the first things he did when he became president was he asked Defense Secretary Robert McNamara to determine how big the gap was. McNamara immediately reported there was no missile gap. It was a few months later that Roswell Kilpatrick announced that the United States had a tremendous advantage over the Soviet Union, that the United States was way ahead of the Soviets in missiles and bombs and bombers. However, the Strategic Air Command announced that it wanted 10,000 more intercontinental ballistic missiles. The Air Force said it wanted 3,000 more. Robert McNamara finally agreed on the number of 1,000 as the lowest number he could get away with. Well, how did that look to the Soviet leaders? The Soviets knew that the United States was already ahead 10 to 1 to 100 to 1 in all categories of weaponry. And they believed that this meant the US was planning for a surprise nuclear attack against the Soviet Union. The second crucial factor is the 1959 Cuban Revolution. The US attempted to overthrow the revolution with the Bay of Pigs invasion in April of '61. Kennedy learned some lessons from that. He said after that, he no longer trusted those CIA bastards or Joint Chiefs sons of bitches. He said he was going to shatter the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter them in the wind. He put the CIA agents under the ambassadors in all the foreign countries. He fired the top 3 people in the CIA. He told his aides not to trust the intelligence people or the generals. But the United States also began a program to overthrow the Cuban government. It was called Operation Mongoose. It was headed by Robert Kennedy and Edward Lansdale. It was a terrorist program, including economic sabotage and also assassination of Castro. The US began plans to invade Cuba. It had conducted several major military exercises in the Caribbean, one of which was called Operation Ortsac. Ortsac is Castro spelled backwards. So it was clear the US was planning and had plans to invade Cuba. Khrushchev decided to put missiles in Cuba to both redress the imbalance in strategic weapons. He said, also, I'm going to give you a taste of your own medicine. Now we can swat your ass. He also thought this was the way to protect Cuba from the US invasion. But he made a catastrophic blunder. By not announcing that the missiles and the warheads were in Cuba, that there were also 100 battlefield nuclear weapons, had he announced that, the United States could not have considered invading. Khrushchev was planning to announce the weapons there on November 7th, on the 45th anniversary of the Russian Revolution. But the biggest difference, I think, now is the difference in the quality of leadership. Khrushchev and Kennedy are not comparable, unfortunately, to Putin and Biden. Putin wants to make Russia great again. Biden announced that he's going to make America great again, restore America's great global leadership. Khrushchev said that he couldn't sleep for days after he'd been briefed on nuclear weapons in 1953. He commented to Norman Cousins, he said, "Peace is the most important goal in the world. If we don't have peace and the nuclear bombs start to fall, what difference will it make whether we are communists or Catholic or capitalists or Chinese or Russians or Americans? Who could tell us apart? Who will be left to tell us apart?" Kennedy shared that sentiment. During the crisis, he said to a female friend, he said, "I'd rather my children be red than dead." That's the opposite of Eisenhower. Eisenhower had said, "I'd rather be atomized than communized." But both Kennedy and Khrushchev knew what war was like. Both had fought in World War II. Both did everything they could once the crisis began to avert a war and a nuclear war. And Kennedy often stood alone against all of his military and political advisors. He was often the only one in the room who looked for a peaceful solution. His advisors wanted, and Joint Chiefs of Staff all wanted, to bomb the missile sites and then invade and overthrow the Castro government. General Curtis LeMay, who's known for the firebombing campaign in World War II in Japan, LeMay actually wanted nuclear war. He said, this is the greatest advantage we're going to have over the Soviets ever. We can defeat them now. We should get this over with. During the crisis, he assured Kennedy that if the US invaded Cuba, the Soviets would do nothing. Kennedy said, well, they have to move in Berlin at least. And LeMay insisted they would do nothing. Kennedy remarked to his aide, Kenneth O'Donnell, can you imagine LeMay saying a thing like that? These brass hats have one great advantage in their favor. If we listen to them and do what they want us to do, none of us will be alive later to tell them that they were wrong. But Kennedy stood up to them. Adlai Stevenson also urged a peaceful resolution, but they were up against the political advisors, the military advisors, the former advisors, Eisenhower, Acheson, Nitze, and all of them who wanted the invasion. But Kennedy looked for another alternative. We came so close to nuclear war. October 27th, 1962, Arthur Schlesinger said, was not only the most dangerous moment in the Cold War, it was the most dangerous moment in all of human history. On that day, the Russian submarines accompanying the ships going toward the quarantine line, the USS Randolph started dropping depth charges on the Soviet B-59 submarine. The power was knocked out. The carbon dioxide levels were at lethal levels. People were passing out in the sub, and the commander, Savitsky, ordered them to get ready their nuclear torpedo for a strike. We are lucky that on that ship was also Vasily Arkhipov, and Arkhipov managed to talk Savitsky down. Had they launched that nuclear torpedo, World War III would have started right then. Also, on Okinawa, there are reports that Air Force Captain William Bassett disobeyed a mistaken order to launch his 32 cruise nuclear missiles against Russia and China. We came that close in those and other instances also. There was also a lot of miscalculation and ignorance. The United States did not know the warheads had arrived. The US intelligence had only spotted 33 of the 42 missiles, had no idea where the warheads were. What McNamara calculated was that there were 10,000 Soviet troops and 100,000 armed Cubans in Cuba. He said, if we invaded, that would have been 18,000 casualties and 4,500 dead. He later found out there were not 10,000 Soviet troops, there were 42,000 Soviet troops. There were not 100,000 armed Cubans, there were 270,000 armed Cubans. He then calculated there had been 25,000 Americans dead. When he found out in 1992 that there were also 100 battlefield nuclear weapons there, he now estimated there would have been 100,000 Americans dead. He said we would have definitely wiped out Cuba and almost certainly gone to war with the Soviet Union. So we survived as much by luck as by statesmanship. In fact, Kennedy and Khrushchev both drew that lesson. They both knew they had lost control. Khrushchev did not order the U-2 to be shot down on October 27th. He ordered the opposite. He did not authorize troops to use battlefield nuclear weapons, but he knew that there was a real possibility they would use them anyway in the event of an invasion. The American side, Strategic Air Command sent a test missile from Vandenberg Air Force Base toward the Marshall Islands mistakenly, and US officials mistakenly reported that Tampa, Florida, and Minnesota were under attack. As Dean Acheson later said, we survived the crisis by pure, dumb luck. But we were lucky again that it was Kennedy and Khrushchev who were desperately looking for a non-military off-ramp. After the crisis ended, Khrushchev wrote a remarkable letter to Kennedy on October 30th, 1962. And he says, evil has brought some good. The good is now that people have felt more tangibly the breathing of the burning flames of thermonuclear war and have a more clear realization of the threat looming over them if the arms race is not stopped. He said, in light of this, we have to eliminate all conflicts between us that could possibly cause another crisis. Said we have to eliminate the crisis over China, over Berlin. And he said, and he offered proposals, and he asked for counter proposals from Kennedy. And Kennedy responded, and he gave his extraordinary American University commencement address. And one of the things he said there rings so true today. He said, nuclear powers must avert those confrontations which bring an adversary to a choice of either a humiliating retreat or a nuclear war. To adopt that kind of course in the nuclear age would be evidence only of the bankruptcy of our policy or of a collective death wish for the world. The mythology surrounding the crisis was that the reason why the Soviets backed down was because Kennedy was so strong. He was tough. He was unrelenting. So he's backed down in the face of greater American strength. As Dean Rusk said, the US Secretary of State said, we're eyeball to eyeball, and I think the other fellow just blinked. They turned this into a game of chicken, and that's what the public response was. We know that the reality was quite different. We know that we escaped this crisis. It ended because of negotiations, diplomacy, backdoor channels, and negotiations. Robert Kennedy went to visit Dobrynin on the night of October 27th and said something must be done immediately or the invasion is going to start. He said his brother might be overthrown by the military. And he says, even though the president himself was very much against starting a war over Cuba, an irreversible chain of events could occur against his will. He said if the situation continues for much longer, the president is not sure that the military will not overthrow him and seize power. The American military could get out of control. And it was then that they agreed that they would remove the missile to be a guarantee, no invasion of Cuba, and that the United States would remove its missiles from Turkey 5 or 6 months after this agreement, if it was not revealed publicly. The truth did not come out for another 27 years. The message was the wrong one. The message the public got was that strength prevailed. The reality was that diplomacy and negotiation prevailed. But we face the same choice again today. And when Zelensky says he's not going to give up 1 inch of Ukrainian territory to the Russians, that they're going to fight this out to the end, and Biden supports him, and the French and everybody in Europe supports him, at the same time that they also recognize that Putin, if he is put in the corner, will do what he has been threatening, and that is use nuclear weapons. But the American policy is to put Putin in that corner where he has the choice that Kennedy warned against between a humiliating defeat and the use of nuclear weapons. And we talk about tactical nuclear weapons as if they're nothing major. Well, the reality is that the tactical nuclear weapons range in size from 0.3 of a kiloton to 170 kilotons. The weapons that were used in Hiroshima was the equivalent of about 16 kilotons. So some of these tactical nuclear weapons are more than 10 times as powerful as the weapons used in Hiroshima. These are not little weapons. And as Biden correctly warned, use of a tactical nuclear weapon could end up with Armageddon. That the cycle of escalation, what we know from all the war games that we've blown over the years, is that it's almost impossible to start a nuclear war once it begins. Ukraine is the immediate crisis. We also face a crisis over China that could lead to a major power war. So we're carrying out a policy that is on the surface, I believe, not only quite dangerous, but quite insane. Because if the logic is carried out and the US succeeds in what it wants to do, which is to defeat Russia, to weaken Russia, to put Russia in a position where it has to choose between defeat and using tactical nuclear weapons or worse, then I think that makes no sense at all. And the effects that a lot of this is having is to, if anything, create the conditions in the US and other countries that are going to lead to more right-wing governments, even fascist governments taking power. So I think I've gone over my time limit, but thank you very much for listening.
Thank you. Thank you indeed. Thank you indeed for the introductions. And I forgot before to remind people that at 7 minutes, I will give one little reminder of the 7 minutes, and then I will do that again at 10 so that we will be sharp on time. We have clearly a very important conversation to have, and this introductory remark from Professor Kuczynski are very important. We will hear now from Professor Adriano Roccucci.
Well, I am an historian. I will talk about 1962, and I will speak in Italian. Ma mi ritrovo con molte delle sottolineature che ha fatto Peter Kuznick nel suo intervento, e vorrei aggiungerne solamente altre sull'inquadramento storico e poi rilevare alcune questioni. È vero, è molto vero quello che diceva Peter Kuznick: la retorica storica sulla crisi dei missili di Cuba è stata quella di dire che una linea ferma, di risposta ferma, è ciò che ha permesso agli Stati Uniti di risolvere la questione e di superare quella che era la minaccia che Khrushchev e l'Unione Sovietica stava portando direttamente agli Stati Uniti attraverso Cuba. Ma in realtà non fu questo la modalità con cui la crisi venne risolta, ma fu risolta grazie a un compromesso. Fu grazie a un compromesso che il potenziale esplosivo della crisi dei missili di Cuba fu disinnescato. Khrushchev propose a Washington di ritirare i missili da Cuba in cambio della promessa degli Stati Uniti di non invadere Cuba e la richiesta di rimuovere i missili Jupiter che erano collocati in Turchia e in Italia, da cui potevano colpire l'Unione Sovietica. Kennedy accettò le proposte, facendo sapere che non poteva però convenire su un do ut des, e quindi che avrebbe risolto il problema dei missili in Turchia e in Italia nel giro di alcuni mesi successivi, ma che lo scambio sarebbe stato quello della promessa di non invadere e da parte sovietica di ritirare la presenza militare dall'isola di Cuba. Questo fu il compromesso che fu accettato e che portò appunto a disinnescare la crisi. Ma se non ci fossero state le concessioni sovietiche, l'esito avrebbe potuto essere ben diverso. Quindi in questo senso condivido molto che la percezione che gli Stati Uniti siano usciti vincitori da un braccio di ferro e la conseguente esaltazione di una linea di fermezza assoluta, da una parte non corrispondono a quelle che furono le intenzioni di Kennedy, perché non era questa la linea di Kennedy, l'ha detto Kuznick, né all'effettiva soluzione della crisi, che fu attraverso un compromesso, e dall'altra rischiano di non fare i conti con il fatto che l'esito positivo non fosse scontato e che in tal caso il prezzo da pagare sarebbe stato enormemente alto. Ma come si arrivò alla soluzione di questa crisi? Un elemento essenziale fu la disponibilità e la ricerca di canali di comunicazione tra il Cremlino e la Casa Bianca. Fu una condizione decisiva che rese possibile il raggiungimento del compromesso, il quale permise di uscire dal vicolo cieco cui sembrava destinata l'escalation. Due furono i piani in cui si operò in questo senso. Uno fu quello della diplomazia ufficiale, rispetto al quale mi sembrano opportune due osservazioni. La prima riguarda la funzione delle rappresentanze diplomatiche degli ambasciatori, i quali non sono dei propagandisti né degli attori di divisione, ma hanno la funzione primaria di essere un fondamentale canale di comunicazione tra i governi. È un interesse di tutte le parti che tali canali funzionino e non vengano ristretti fino a diventare inefficaci. Durante la crisi, l'ambasciatore sovietico a Washington, Anatoly Dobrynin, svolse un ruolo chiave e gli incontri tra lui e Robert Kennedy furono decisivi perché rappresentarono il canale attraverso il quale furono comunicate a Mosca le reali intenzioni di Washington. La seconda osservazione è che il gioco diplomatico e il dialogo politico tra governi contemplano fasi diverse, nelle quali sovente non tutte le carte vengono gettate sul tavolo. Pur in presenza di reticenze e perfino di menzogne che si presentano in tali fasi, non viene inficiata la validità del ricorso al dialogo e al negoziato in momenti successivi. Il 18 ottobre del 62 si tenne un incontro tra Kennedy e il ministro degli esteri sovietico Andrei Gromyko, 2 ore di conversazioni surreali, durante le quali il ministro ripeté false assicurazioni sul fatto che Mosca non aveva installato missili a Cuba e il presidente non rivelò le informazioni di cui disponeva. Potremmo dire una totale diffidenza l'uno dell'altro, eppure negli stessi giorni non si esitò a ricorrere all'ambasciatore sovietico, come abbiamo visto, o non mancò una fitta corrispondenza tra i 2 leader. Il secondo piano in cui canali di comunicazione giocarono un ruolo di grande rilievo fu quello della diplomazia informale, cioè dell'azione di esponenti della società civile o di attori singolari della comunità internazionale. In questo ambito protagonista fu Papa Giovanni XXIII, il cui contributo alla soluzione della crisi non sempre è stato rilevato in maniera sufficiente dalla storiografia, sovente centrata solo sulla diplomazia ufficiale. Giovanni XXIII, come ha rilevato nei suoi studi Andrea Riccardi, con il suo impegno per la pace si poneva al di sopra delle divisioni della Guerra Fredda, in qualche modo modificando la linea che la Santa Sede aveva seguito durante il pontificato di Pio XII, diventando, con Giovanni XXIII, in tal modo un interlocutore interessante per il Cremlino. Preciso che queste interlocuzioni avvengono tra persone che hanno visioni del mondo totalmente diverse e antagoniste. È molto giusto quello che dice Kuznik sul rapporto tra Kennedy e Khrushchev, ma non è che Kennedy e Khrushchev erano 2 leader che condividevano una piattaforma liberal-democratica. Khrushchev era un romantico rivoluzionario, convinto leninista, che aveva scelto la linea della coesistenza pacifica perché riteneva che nell'epoca della guerra nucleare non si potesse pensare come pensava l'ultimo Stalin a una nuova guerra inevitabile, ma non rinunciava al fatto della vittoria della rivoluzione a livello mondiale e quindi di una lotta in cui evidentemente l'antagonista erano i sistemi capitalistici e liberal-democratici. Cioè il negoziato, il compromesso si trova tra gente anche che pensa in maniera totalmente diversa e hanno visioni contrapposte l'une alle altre, così potremmo dire tra il Papa e lo stesso Khrushchev. L'intervento di Giovanni XXIII nella crisi dei missili di Cuba fu sollecitato da un religioso, un domenicano, Felix Morlion, che nei giorni della crisi partecipava da osservatore a un incontro di accademici e giornalisti americani e sovietici negli Stati Uniti, dove maturò l'idea di rivolgere al Papa la richiesta di un suo intervento. Il capo della delegazione americana all'incontro, il giornalista americano Norman Cousins, caporedattore della rivista Saturday Review, verificò presso un consigliere del presidente che Kennedy era favorevole a un intervento del Papa, mentre un membro della delegazione sovietica ottenne da Mosca l'informazione che Khrushchev avrebbe accolto positivamente un appello del Papa. Dopo aver ricevuto assicurazioni che il suo intervento sarebbe stato gradito, il 25 ottobre del 1962, quindi domani è l'anniversario, Giovanni XXIII pronunciò un radiomessaggio alla Radio Vaticana con cui lanciò un appello affinché si avviassero negoziati per risolvere la crisi. appello che fu consegnato in anticipo alle ambasciate americana e sovietica a Roma. Il New York Times e il Times riportarono ampiamente il messaggio del Papa e, fatto eccezionale, a Mosca la Pravda pubblicava un resoconto del messaggio. La Pravda, per chi non lo sa, era l'organo ufficiale del Partito Comunista dell'Unione Sovietica. Era un'attenzione insolita e significativa da Mosca a un atto di un Papa, considerato fino ad allora l'ideologo del blocco occidentale. Giovanni XXIII in questo radiomessaggio si faceva interprete dell'inquietudine per le nubi minacciose che, cito, oscuravano nuovamente l'orizzonte internazionale e seminavano la paura in milioni di famiglie. Proseguì. Voglio qui citare un estratto di questo radiomessaggio un po' più lungo, e chiedo permesso al moderatore di farlo. Noi ricordiamo, sono le parole di Giovanni XXIII, a questo proposito i gravi doveri di coloro che hanno la responsabilità del potere, e aggiungiamo, con la mano sulla coscienza, che ascoltino il grido angoscioso che da tutti i punti della terra, dai bambini innocenti agli anziani, dalle persone alle comunità, sale verso il cielo. Pace, pace. E credo che tutti noi evochiamo il titolo di questo nostro incontro, ascoltando le parole di Giovanni XXIII, il quale continuiamo. Noi rinnoviamo oggi questa solenne implorazione. Noi supplichiamo tutti i governanti a non restare sordi a questo grido dell'umanità, che facciano tutto quello che è il loro potere per salvare la pace. Eviteranno così al mondo gli orrori di una guerra, di cui non si può prevedere quali saranno le terribili conseguenze. Che continuino a trattare, perché questa attitudine leale e aperta è una grande testimonianza per la coscienza di ognuno e davanti alla storia. Promuovere, favorire, accettare i dialoghi a tutti i livelli e in ogni tempo è una regola di saggezza e di prudenza. Si trattò di un intervento che contribuì a creare le condizioni perché il negoziato riservato, che stava in quelle ore procedendo tra Mosca e Washington, arrivasse in porto. L'appello sicuramente non lasciò indifferente Khrushchev. Non abbiamo evidenze documentarie sulla reazione di Kennedy, ma su Khrushchev sappiamo che il 13 dicembre, a crisi conclusa, incontrò Cousins, con il quale aveva un rapporto precedente, e gli disse: l'appello del Papa fu un vero raggio di luce, gliene fui molto grato, mi creda, quelli furono giorni molto pericolosi. Fu reale il pericolo di una guerra nucleare? Già Kusnik ne ha parlato abbastanza, soltanto per sottolineare che il pericolo di un'escalation nucleare non è solo e tanto legato all'intenzionalità degli attori politici e dei decisori, ma è legato alle capacità, alle possibilità che entri in funzione una spirale incontrollabile e che incidenti imprevisti o poca conoscenza gli uni degli altri porti a questa escalation. Ad esempio, gli Stati Uniti non sapevano che a Cuba c'erano, oltre ai missili già installati e a quelli che arrivarono, alcune bombe atomiche tattiche. Non erano a conoscenza. E non sapevano nemmeno che Khrushchev aveva dato le indicazioni ai comandanti militari a Cuba di poter utilizzare queste armi in caso di attacco americano senza chiedere il permesso a Mosca. Quindi un livello di pericolo molto alto, tanto che lui se ne accorge e a un certo punto, mi pare il 27, toglie questo potere ai comandi militari. Dice: anche su questo dovete chiedere il permesso a Mosca. E vado a concludere molto rapidamente. La crisi, quindi, favorì l'acquisizione della consapevolezza che il potere distruttivo degli arsenali nucleari, anche in una condizione di squilibrio, qual era quella del tempo, perché c'era uno squilibrio, gli Stati Uniti avevano molte più capacità di sferrare colpi dell'Unione Sovietica, ma anche in queste condizioni di squilibrio
l'uso degli arsenali nucleari avrebbe comportato un livello tale di devastazione da rendere certa e inevitabile la reciproca distruzione. Ne derivava che la guerra tra potenze nucleari fosse un'opzione impossibile, proprio perché autodistruttiva e apocalittica. L'enciclica di Giovanni XXIII, Pacem in Terris, pubblicata poco dopo, l'11 aprile 1963 e poco prima che Giovanni XXIII morisse, esprimeva questo sentire. Permettetemi, con questo concludo, un'ultima citazione dalla Pacem in Terris. Si diffonde sempre più tra gli esseri umani la persuasione che le eventuali controversie tra i popoli non debbano essere risolte con il ricorso alle armi, ma invece attraverso il negoziato. Vero è che sul terreno storico quella persuasione è piuttosto in rapporto con la forza terribilmente distruttiva delle armi moderne ed è alimentata dall'orrore che suscita nell'animo anche solo il pensiero delle distruzioni immani e dei dolori immensi che l'uso di quelle armi apporterebbe alla famiglia umana, per cui riesce quasi impossibile pensare che nell'era atomica la guerra possa essere utilizzata come strumento di giustizia. Lo studioso di storia è consapevole che il ricorso ai precedenti storici è sovente fuorviante, perché la storia non si ripete. Tuttavia credo che dall'analisi di quanto avvenne in quei 13 giorni dell'ottobre 1962 si possono trarre elementi di riflessione utili per un tempo come il nostro, in cui il mondo si è pericolosamente avvicinato di nuovo all'orlo della catastrofe nucleare. Grazie.
Thank you. Thank you, Adriano Roccucci. Wonderful presentation. I'll give the floor to Martin Hellman first and then to Kerry Kennedy. They are speaking from the United States, and we will then listen from Jeff Sachs here. Professor Hellman, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you. And in terms of language, I first of all want to thank everyone for putting up with my English. I don't speak very much Italian, and my Russian is limited to "Я не говорю по-русски," which means I don't speak Russian. I'm honored to participate in the Vatican's and Sant'Egidio's Cry for Peace conference. The world has been crying for peace for ages, and my talk today will explain why that plea must be met for humanity to survive. It must be met. After the Cuban Missile Crisis, President Kennedy estimated the odds of war had been somewhere between 1 in 3 and even. In that estimation, he said that the crisis was like playing a global version of Russian roulette with a 2 or 3 chambered nuclear gun. I call that suicidal game nuclear roulette. Other crises have had more chambers in the gun. Other wars have had more chambers in the gun. But it doesn't matter if there are 2 chambers or 200. If we keep pulling the trigger, inevitably the gun will go off. If we keep having wars, eventually one will escalate out of control. Viewed differently, viewed from that perspective, the nuclear threat can become the nuclear opportunity to build the kind of more peaceful world that this conference is talking about. So it's important not to separate nuclear weapons as somehow distinct from war. The two are really part of a combined system. You need to take a system perspective. I first came up with that inevitability argument almost 40 years ago. And more recently, I tried to shoot holes in it to see if it needed strengthening or modification. The only possible hole that I could find was that that same inevitability argument applied to an extinction level asteroid hitting Earth. That happens about once every 100 million years. And if the risk of nuclear war were comparable, then our rate of progress would be acceptable. But even if we could expect to survive just 1 million years of nuclear deterrence, that would probably suffice. You don't need 100 million. While such a low level of risk seems ludicrous to me, it obviously does not to many others. As one example, the late CIA Director James Schlesinger said that we would need nuclear deterrence, quote, more or less in perpetuity. So I started researching how to quantify the risk. A year and a half ago, I published a paper explaining why the risk of a major nuclear war was comparable to playing nuclear roulette about once every 15 years, which means pulling the trigger about 5 times over the life of a child born today. That is horribly dangerous, and we need to stop. A few months after I wrote that paper, former Secretary of Defense William Perry told me that he agreed with my estimate and that I could quote him. He holds a doctorate in math, so he knows numbers as well as national security. The Cuban Missile Crisis played a key role in my argument in that paper for the level of risk being that large. When I wrote that paper a year and a half ago, it had been almost 60 years since the 1962 crisis. So to first order, we should expect a crisis of that magnitude, meaning just a 2 or 3 chambered nuclear gun, about once every 60 years. If we were to continue the policies of the last 60 years for the next 1,000, we would expect 10 to 20 such crises comparable to Cuba 1962. Having studied that crisis in great detail, it was clearly ridiculous to assume we could survive so many crises, 10 or 20 of them. As just one example of the risk during the crisis, and that Peter Kuznick already mentioned, American destroyers attacked 3 Soviet submarines near the quarantine line. Only 40 years later did we learn that each of those subs carried a nuclear torpedo, and in one case came close to using it. Having ruled out 1 chance in 1,000 per year as too small, I then ruled out 1 chance in 10 per year as too large. At that level of risk, 1 in 10 per year, we would have to have been unbelievably lucky to survive the last 60 years. That left my estimate of 1 chance in 100 per year as what engineers and scientists call an order of magnitude estimate, meaning it's approximate. And that corresponds to playing nuclear roulette once every 15 years. I'm going to see if I can screen share. If I can, let's see. Yes, I can. Oh, let me bring up the appropriate. There we go. Let me say, there we go. Imagine a man wearing a TNT vest were to sit down next to you and tell you that he isn't a suicide bomber. So there's nothing to worry about. He doesn't have the button for setting off the explosives. Rather, there are 2 buttons in very safe hands. One was in Washington with President Trump for 4 years, a nice, cautious man, nothing to worry about, and is now under Biden's thumb, also cautious. The other button is in Moscow with President Putin, he told you. Again, a cautious man, so just relax. You'd still get away as fast as you can. Just because we can't see the weapons controlled by those buttons, why do we stay here? As if confronted by that guy in the TNT vest, we need to be plotting an escape route. Just because the Earth's explosive vest has not yet gone off, we shouldn't assume that it never will. Let me go back and bring up, this is what I need. My estimate that we were playing nuclear roulette once every 15 years was made 18 months ago prior to Putin's invasion of Ukraine. Now I estimate that the risk is more like pulling the trigger once every year that this war drags on. There's not time to explain today why the risk is that large, but I've written a report that goes into more detail, and I've sent the link to the conference organizers. And if you go to my Stanford publications page, it's number 84, the last one other than a few books. Since this is a conference sponsored by the Vatican and Sant'Egidio, I will include a quote from the Gospels, Matthew 7:4 and 7:5, which I'll paraphrase. Why do you worry about the speck of dust in your neighbor's eye when you have a 2x4 in your own? Now, the Americans will understand what a 2x4 is, but for the Europeans, I'll point out it's a sturdy piece of lumber. With the war in Ukraine, we need to change that because our neighbor is now Vladimir Putin, and he doesn't just have a speck of dust in his eye, but with the horrors of the war in Ukraine, he probably has a 4x8, an even bigger piece of lumber in his eye. But it makes sense to remove the 2x4 from our own eye before trying to help Putin remove his 4x8. But what piece of lumber do we in the West have in our eyes? Well, here there's time to just explain one. There are others in the report that I mentioned. One of the our blind spots is our dangerous, overly simplified narrative about the war in Ukraine. We in the West tend to see the war as solely Russia's fault. In contrast, while 85% of Ukrainians in the University of Chicago poll see Russia as responsible for the war, 70% say the same about their own government, and 58% say that about the United States. I don't have time today to explain why Ukrainians blame their own government and ours along with Russia, but the report I mentioned goes into more detail. Nuclear weapons and other technologies have given a new global meaning to Deuteronomy's injunction where God tells humanity, I have set before you life and death, blessing and curse. Choose life that you and your descendants may live. To choose life, we must choose peace. Nothing less will work. That's why Jesus said, blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called children of God. Thank you.
Thank you indeed. I promise Professor Hellman that we will make available the material through the conference website. You can certainly, if you go to the Professor Hellman bio, you will find many of the links to the papers, to the different material that he mentioned. The floor is now given to Kerry Kennedy and then to Jeffrey Sachs. You are muted. You are muted. You need to unmute. Sorry. 4. We were listening before, so definitely there was connection before. Now it's fine. Fantastic. Technology is helping. Very nice.
Thank you. Thank you. Buongiorno. Thank you to all my friends at Sant'Egidio and very much for inviting me to speak here today about the Cuban Missile Crisis. The last time I was together with Sant'Egidio was at the presentation of the St. Valentine Award, which I treasure. So I have to say I was shocked that this panel started with an ad hominem attack, first on Attorney General Robert Kennedy, and then on President Kennedy by a revisionist historian whose books and articles have been criticized by widely respected historians. The lessons from President Kennedy's leadership should inform not only our thoughts today about war and peace, but how we conduct ourselves in our day-to-day lives. Reflecting on his leadership, his commitment to peace, his concern about the innocents in the next generation are all gifts of the spirit. Despite the aggressive Cold War palaver that Jack used in his campaign rhetoric and to some extent in his inaugural address, his greatest ambition as president was to keep the peace. In his inaugural address, and again 60 years ago, he said, quote, "We have the capacity to make this the best generation in the history of mankind or the last," unquote. He told Ben Bradley, who was one of his closest friends, that he wanted his epitaph to read, "He kept the peace." His Defense Department Secretary, Robert McNamara, later commented, quote, "I think his view was that his primary responsibility as president was to keep the country out of war, if at all possible," unquote. McNamara admitted that Jack succeeded under the most adverse circumstances, surrounded as he was by warmongering generals, congressional hawks, and a highly militarized Washington establishment, all convinced that war with the Soviets was not only inevitable, but was desirable. At the beginning of his administration, Jack met with Khrushchev in Vienna and brought him a small model of old Ironsides, the ship my grandma Rose used to take her children and us, her grandchildren, to sea in Boston Harbor. Pointing to the cannons, Jack said that in those days, you could see the person you were shooting. But today, we could shoot over great distances and kill millions or even hundreds of millions of people, both innocents as well as military, and that we had to take on a new moral responsibility toward the powers that our nations were wielding. He was surprised by Khrushchev's response. Khrushchev was bombastic, pugnacious, and unwilling to negotiate or move. Jack went back to the United States badly shaken. During the summer of 1961, the US military, under the direction of General Lucius Clay, took a series of unauthorized, provocative actions against the Soviets along the Berlin Wall. This culminated on January 27, 1961, when Soviet and US tanks loaded with live munitions faced one another at Checkpoint Charlie, the line dividing East and West Berlin. On September 29, 1961, Khrushchev wrote Jack a letter, the first of 26 secret letters between the two of them. It was smuggled to Jack by Georgy Bolshakov, which he handed to Pierre Salinger, folded in a copy of the New York Times. Bolshakov was a KGB spy who used to frequent Hickory Hill, our home in Northern Virginia. He was a bon vivant, and he used to delight us kids by doing traditional Russian dancing, and my mother would egg him on to have push-up contests and arm wrestling contests with my father. The CIA was horrified that we would let somebody into our house who was a known spy. But with the Berlin crisis, Khrushchev began using him to end-run the KGB and the military establishment. The letter was essentially an apology for Vienna. Khrushchev sent his letter from his Black Sea retreat, his dacha, and in it, Khrushchev referenced the Bible, writing, "We're all on this ark together, and no matter whether we are clean or unclean, we all have an interest in having the ark continue to float." Jack took that biblical imagery and replied to Khrushchev. On October 16th, from his desk in Hyannisport, just about 6 blocks from where I'm speaking to you now, looking out over the field where we played baseball every day, Jack described Hyannisport as the place where his children played with their cousins, saying that we had a moral interest in making sure that innocent people like our children were not incinerated by thermonuclear mistakes made by hard-headed politicians. In the second letter, Khrushchev said, quote, "I have no ground to retreat further. There is a precipice behind me," unquote. Jack understood at that point that Khrushchev was in the exact same situation Jack was in. They were both confronting their own military and intelligence complex that was intent on going to war. Jack understood Khrushchev's predicament and gave him the room he needed. He told him at the time, "If you withdraw your tanks, I'll withdraw mine within 20 minutes. Jack said to his advisors at the time, who wanted him to launch attacks on the Russians, "I am not going to start a war over driving rights on the Autobahn." In the aftermath of the crisis, General Lucius Clay called Jack a traitor for not using the atomic bomb on the Soviets. In Cuba, Jack again resisted the hardliners intent on going to war, first during the Bay of Pigs and later during the Cuban Missile Crisis. During the Bay of Pigs, CIA Director Allen Dulles and Deputy Director Richard Bissell assured Jack that the invasion of Cuba would succeed because the US-backed forces were superior to the Cuban forces and Castro was wildly unpopular. We now know that Dulles and Bissell said that what Dulles and Bissell said to the president, knowing both statements were untrue. but they believed that a young, inexperienced president faced with military defeat only 3 months into office would, in the heat of the moment, fold to military and intelligence advisors and send the Essex aircraft carrier, starting a ground war. Jack later said, "They thought I'd send in the Essex, and they thought wrong. Dulles and Bissell tried to get him to go to war, and he fired them both." Afterwards, Jack said he wanted, quote, "to splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds," unquote. The basic facts of the Cuban Missile Crisis are well known. In October 1962, an American U-2 spy plane secretly photographed nuclear missile sites being built by the Soviet Union on the island of Cuba. Jack placed a naval blockade around the island to prevent the Soviets from bringing in more military supplies. After 13 days of tension, Jack and Khrushchev publicly agreed that the Soviets would dismantle the weapon sites in exchange for a pledge from the United States not to invade Cuba. The US also secretly agreed to remove its nuclear missiles from Turkey, missiles which Jack had already ordered the Defense Department to dismantle 3 times. My father later said that 8 of the 13 members of the XCOM wanted an invasion or an air attack until the bitter end. We now know that the Russian commanders of all those missile sites had authorization to launch if they felt themselves threatened, and that at least 70 million Americans would have died instantaneously. Jack told Daddy, we could take 1 Bay of Pigs, but if we had 3, we would have a coup d'etat. During the 13 days, their hold on power became increasingly tenuous as generals and the intelligence apparatus became overtly rebellious and insubordinate. At the boiling point, Jack instructed the Navy to stay away from Cuba to avoid risking an accidental provocation. Admiral George Anderson promptly violated Jack's order by sending ships near the Cuban shore and made his deputy, Tommy Powers, without presidential authority, elevate alert levels to DEFCON 2, 1 step below full nuclear war, and broadcast the provocation to the Russians. The CIA, in direct disobedience of presidential directive, dropped 60 elite commandos into Cuba to prepare the ground for the invasion they hoped would follow. Daddy went through the roof when he learned of the incidents of insubordination. Bill Harvey, the CIA officer who had green-lighted the commandos, called Jack's unwillingness to launch treasonous. Incensed brass were in a state of disbelief at what they considered bald treachery to our country by the president. Admiral George Anderson screamed at Daddy, "We have been had." Pentagon defense analyst Daniel Ellsberg, who years later leaked the Pentagon Papers, described the atmosphere in Arlington at the Pentagon. He said, quote, "There was virtually a coup atmosphere in Pentagon circles. Spoiling for war to end all wars, LeMay found consolation by allowing himself to believe that all was not lost. Quote, why don't we go there on Monday and make a strike anyway? Unquote. LeMay ventured hopefully as he watched the crisis subside. We lost, he fulminated. We ought to go in there and knock them off, unquote. Jack graciously hosted a White House reception for the Joint Chiefs in a magnanimous gesture to thank them and share with them some of the undeserved credit for the successful resolution of the missile crisis. The Joint Chiefs rejected the olive branch, and an insubordinate LeMay raged at Jack in public, "It's the greatest defeat in our history. We should invade today." Weeks later, still boiling, he complained to the chiefs bitterly, We had a chance to throw the communists out of Cuba, but the administration was scared to death that the Russians might shoot a missile at us. Unquote. Nixon publicly chimed in with the die-hard wingnuts, condemning Jack for pulling defeat out of the jaws of victory, unquote. Reflecting on the Berlin crisis, the Bay of Pigs, the Cuban Missile Crisis, it is terrifying to consider how close we came to indeed making this the last generation of mankind. Our world was saved again and again and again by leaders who listened carefully to advisors but acted independently, who were willing to consider war but were committed to peace. Leaders who had the courage to stand up to the Pentagon, to the CIA, and the military-industrial congressional complex, and who had the sensitivity to understand the plight of their enemies. Leaders whose judgment was sound, whose imagination soared, who spoke truth to power. Those leaders echo Stephen Spender's famous lines, "I think continually of those who were truly great, the names of those who in their life fought for life, who wore at their hearts the fire's center. Born of the sun, they traveled a short distance towards the sun and left the vivid air signed with their honor." Thank you.
Thank you, Kerry Kennedy, and I hope that the Italian in the audience, felt the differences of voices in the speakers, and we'll definitely get into more through the debate. The floor is to Jeffrey Sachs.
I'm just going to stop there for a second.
Thank you to Sant'Egidio, and thank you to all of the people here and all of the religious leaders who are looking for peace. If you're not scared right now, you haven't been listening. And if you're not really frightened by the events taking place in the world, you should be. This is a terrifying moment, and we are absolutely without the leadership that we need to solve this. Of course, we hope that the leaders we have will somehow find the way, but it's our job to press them to do so. We are, as all of the speakers have said, in the most dangerous moment in the world in 60 years. And 60 years ago, we were just at the edge of disaster, and today you hear bantering. Who will do a dirty bomb? Who will escalate? As if this is a normal situation. I want to make a few points to just underscore what you've heard. First, the world is right now in the hands of a very few people. This is not because of the US or Russia or Ukraine or Europe. This is because of a few people in positions of power in those places. The people of Russia, Ukraine, Europe don't want this war, and they don't want nuclear war, but no one's asking them. This is with Biden and a few people around him, and a few military, and a few CIA, and a few other people, and similarly in other governments. And they need to do their job to keep us alive, but they're not doing it right now. They're pulling closer and closer to utter disaster. I know it because I get to watch it close up. I have no confidence in what I'm seeing right now. I spoke with Mr. Borrell recently. I said, we need diplomacy. He said, there can be no diplomacy with Putin. Well, wrong job then, because he's Europe's top diplomat. He better have diplomacy with Putin. What kind of argument is that? We need diplomacy right now. Mr. Zelensky tells us every day we'll recapture every inch of Ukraine. We'll take back Crimea, which, by the way, has been home to the Russian fleet since 1783 until today. Well, he'll take it back over all of our dead bodies. Where is some sense and some measure of prudence and responsibility? Everybody's a maximalist right now. The United States has 1,500 deployed nuclear weapons. Russia has the same number. And we're each talking, we're going to defeat Putin. We have a president that said that man can't stay in power. What does that mean? Over our dead bodies? Our children's? Our grandchildren's? Where are the European leaders, by the way? All they want to do is show how tough they are. Not one dares speak about peace. Although we heard, I was very happy to hear President Macron say it's possible. But where are the calls for negotiation right now? Let me tell you, by the way, negotiations were making progress in mid-March. You can go read about it. Not only propaganda, but each side was saying we're making progress. I've talked to the senior people around that and to the mediators. They were exchanging papers, exchanging documents. And then Ukraine walked away from the negotiations. Ukraine, just to tell you. Why? I don't know for sure. I've tried to understand it better. My feeling is because the United States told them, no, you don't need neutrality. NATO's going to enlarge. You don't have to compromise. We're out to defeat Russia. That's my guess. Why do I say that? Because in the next days, Biden came to Europe and said this is going to be a long war. He didn't say how good to know the negotiations are going on. He said this is going to be a long war. Then he went to Warsaw and he said that man cannot stay in power. Then the U.S. Defense Secretary, Lloyd Austin, said, we want to weaken Russia so it can never do this again. This, to a country with 1,500 nuclear weapons, would be completely reckless under any circumstances. Because as what Peter Kuznick started with was the observation of President Kennedy, but Peter left out two important words, by the way. He got the quote exactly right. He said, nuclear powers must avoid those confrontations which bring the choice of a humiliating retreat or a nuclear war. But the two words before that President Kennedy has in his most remarkable speech on peace on June 10, 1963 is above all, nuclear powers must avoid those confrontations. Above all, that was Kennedy's essence of what he learned in the Cuban Missile Crisis. Don't put your adversary into the choice of a humiliating retreat or a nuclear war. Above all, every day we're out to humiliate Putin in the West. Listen to the rhetoric of our leaders. It's so reckless. Listen to the rhetoric of the Ukrainian leaders. It's reckless. I don't care. Yes, they're fighting. But the idea of humiliating the other side to provoke. And then they say, Zaluzhny said, the Minister of Defense says, well, there may be a nuclear war. There might be. No, there must not be. What are we thinking? I've been at this for a while, not as long, I don't know, but we have these phenomenal panelists and experts, but I've been at it since 1989. I was an advisor to President Gorbachev's economic team. I was an advisor to President Yeltsin's economic team. I was an advisor to President Kuchma's economic team. Ukraine and Russia and the Soviet Union. I've watched this all for more than 32 years, actually. I know what Gorbachev said. He said, we want peace and we want a common European home. And I know what the United States told him and what Germany told him. NATO will not move an inch eastward, not on one occasion, but on countless occasions. That was not incidental, that was not a passing remark, but it was a direct lie of the United States. But don't be shocked by a lie from the United States. It lies a lot. Now, we know already in the mid-1990s, Martin Hellman works with one of our great former defense secretaries, William Perry. William Perry confronted this issue of NATO enlargement and writes about it poignantly in his memoirs of a few years ago. And he said that when this started, he said, no, how can you do this? We're just building confidence with the Russian leadership. But Madeleine Albright, much celebrated hardliner, said, no, NATO expands. That's the neocons in the United States. They have run our government basically since 1992. I know it. I know them personally. I used to teach with many of them at the Kennedy School. That's a breeding ground for neoconservatism. Doesn't seem that way, but that's how empires are made. You have universities which feed the leadership. Perry said, no, don't do this. And he was overruled. And then he agonized, should I resign or not? Because he thought it was so devastating to the chances for peace. And our greatest statesman of the time, George Kennan, who knew Russia from the 1930s onward, said immediately, this is the beginning of the new Cold War with Russia. He thought it was a devastating mistake. Well, 3 countries joined in 1999, Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic. But then George W. Bush was a pure neocon administration. The Iraq War, you may recall. Cheney, you may have heard of. Rumsfeld. Warmongers all. We're going to take out all of the Russian allies out of the Middle East. We'll have wars in Iraq. We'll depose Assad. We'll depose Gaddafi. By the way, they've played out their game plan to complete disaster. One war after another. But Bush expanded NATO to 7 more countries. Bulgaria, Romania, the 3 Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, Slovakia, and Slovenia. All right, now you're starting to get pretty darn close to Russia. It's all been a cheat. But now you're on the Black Sea, you're on the Baltics. But then comes Bush in 2008. And what does he do in Bucharest? He says, we're going to go to Ukraine and we're going to go to Georgia. Take a look at a map and tell me whether Georgia is a North Atlantic state. Okay, a good NATO member. Or instead was the idea, as Brzezinski noted in 1997, to surround Russia in the Black Sea region, Ukraine, Romania, Bulgaria, Turkey, and Georgia. I call it the Second Crimean War. The European leaders knew all of this. Many talked to me. How many said anything in public? None. I don't get it to this day. Europe just does what the US says. Thank you very much. Your new prime minister said, we'll never be the weak link. Why not? Not the weak link, the smart link. Then came the Maidan. I happened to see that by accident up close. The United States helped to provoke through an insurrection the overthrow of a pro-Russian president. Have no doubt about it. The US played its role. There were public protests and the US behind them. And US politicians going to speak to the Maidan as if on our insurrection on January 6, 2021, we had Chinese politicians coming and go march on the Capitol. Well, we did the same. We would never accept it in our capital, but we went to the Capitol, Senator McCain and others, and a lot of things you haven't seen, but I have seen. So the US helped with the overthrow. You know what happened? Of course, immediately Ukraine said, no neutrality. And Putin did what he told George Bush to his face in Bucharest in 2008 would happen. If you try to go to Ukraine and NATO, Crimea's coming back to Russia. Because you're breaking the fragile balance. That's where our fleet is in Sevastopol, against in 1783. This war has been going on a long time, and it is endless provocation. And what do we hear every single day from the US leadership? This is an unprovoked war that started on February 24th, 2022. Unprovoked. Because they don't want you to know any history, any background, any of the facts. They just want quiet so they can prosecute their war. But it's not so easy, because we're doing exactly what President Kennedy warned us, above all, we must not do. And so in the last couple of weeks, Biden himself said we're heading towards Armageddon. You know what happened when he said that, by the way? All of the US media chastised him. Why are you scaring the American people? The stupid politicians in our country said, why is he saying those things? The warmongers, why are you talking that way? Nobody said, oh my God, what should be done? They just criticized him for blurting out a little bit of the truth, which you're not allowed to do. So this is the real lesson of 1962 for us today. The world was saved by a few people in 1962. By Jack Kennedy, by Robert Kennedy, by Adlai Stevenson, by Pope John the 23rd, by Utante, and by Nikita Khrushchev, by a handful of people. That's all. People who loved their children, and you can see why with Kerry Kennedy, because we all love Kerry Kennedy. And we love what they did. They saved the world for us. Now it's our turn. to insist that they save the world now because they're on a reckless course, and Europe needs to raise its voice for peace and negotiation. And we need, please, the religious leaders everywhere. Every government in every part of the world must say clearly, go to negotiate and to compromise. This is the way to save the planet. Thank you.
Thank you. The panelists, thank you to all the speakers, thank you to all in the audience, thank you to all who are listening everywhere around the world. I would like to invite a moment of silence, actually. Because the time is truly difficult. And what we heard are testimonies of difficult decisions that actual people actually made that saved us all. Humans can understand and can avoid the worst. We can also be that humans. Let's take a moment of silence. Thank you. As we prepare for a very brief 10 minutes moment of questions and comments, if there is anybody from the audience that would like to speak, just raise your hand or stand up, and the organizers, very good. There is one person over there, so we can bring the mic and we will hear directly either in English or in Italian, and we will have all the speakers ready. Please say your name and where you're coming from. And
hello, my name is Kate. I'm from Ukraine, from Kiev. And as you know, it's quite sensitive theme for me. And during this discussion, I was crying. And all these months, I was living in Kiev. I woke up in the morning, I'm waking up with explosions. I'm a nurse. I'm a future doctor. I work in a hospital. I treat injured kids. And you know, injured by whom? Injured kids by Russian soldiers. Whole March, I was treated injured kids and civilians from Irpin, Bucha, and Chernihiv. Kids without legs, kids without hands and arms. So we are talking about compromise and negotiations and so on, and it's quite important theme for me, but because it seems about my survival, I want to leave. And you know what? I know that Russian soldiers will not let me leave, because in Ukraine we don't believe them, because they kill civilians in their houses by their missiles and by their weapons. Russians kill Ukrainians, and I don't believe them. I can't believe in their negotiations, because I had in my hands dead children killed by Russians. How can I believe them? We can talk about many things, but how we can do that?
One thing that we can do is remember what Kerry Kennedy was sharing about President Kennedy speaking with Khrushchev in Vienna and saying exactly this, right? Humans started killing each other in so many ways, right? I can kill somebody with my hand, and we should probably ask if my hands are meant to kill somebody. I can kill somebody with my feet, with my knee, with my head, with my elbow. I can kill somebody with many parts of my body. But to kill with a missile allows me not to see the wounded that you are treating. Right? You see the wounded. The one that is throwing the missile doesn't see that anymore. So one of the greatest human fundamental shifts that I think Kerry shared with us beautifully, actually, and I don't know if you want to comment further, Kerry, but this idea that after the atomic bomb was dropped once, the whole understanding of the relationship between a weapon and war, a weapon and humanity has changed. It is not another weapon. It is not the same. It is not right to kill millions of people just by ordering someone else to throw a missile that is 170 times stronger, bigger, with a weapon that is 170 times bigger than Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It's not okay. So the question for all of us is, how are we going to respond to this incredible imbalance of power? This power of the victims, the power of those who can act it upon, and the power of those who can act.
Can I say something?
I think that listening to the grido, the cry, it's very important. It's essential. Before this mega killing actually occurred. We are with you.
Io credo quello che diceva Katia con il suo intervento mostra varie cose. La complessità sfaccettata della situazione in cui noi ci troviamo oggi e la realtà di dolore della guerra. Quando parliamo di guerra, come sembra ogni tanto nel nostro mondo, non parliamo di un campionato di calcio in cui ci sono i tifosi di una parte o dell'altra, ma parliamo di una realtà che colpisce le donne, gli uomini, i bambini e le bambine, come Katia ha raccontato, che fa feriti, fa morti, fa distruzioni, ferisce le persone, colpisce i cuori, traumatizza. Allora, questo richiamo alla follia della guerra, alla follia estrema, una guerra che è anche un ambito in cui molti uomini, non per evocare quella che era un'immagine che uno dei testimoni del Gulag ha riportato, Varlam Shalamov, in cui gli uomini non riconoscono più la differenza tra una fiera e un uomo, tra una bestia e un uomo. La guerra rende bestiali molti uomini. Allora, tutto questo, ha ragione Katia, è una domanda sul, lei lo diceva per sé, il suo futuro, la sua sopravvivenza, ed è una domanda per tutti noi, sul nostro futuro e sulla nostra sopravvivenza. E credo che questo debba animarci a trovare delle vie. Forse non le conosciamo ancora tutte, non comprendiamo come possiamo uscire dalle situazioni in cui ci troviamo, ma c'è bisogno, e credo che nelle tue parole ci sia il grido, ed è giusto che ognuno lo dia dal suo punto di vista. E credo che noi con questo grido di pace sentiamo la responsabilità di dover cercare una risposta, di dover trovare delle vie. Io non ho la formula, ma non credo nessuno di noi qui abbia la formula. Però bisogna cercare, perché ne va della nostra sopravvivenza, ne va del nostro futuro, ne va in primo luogo del futuro e della sopravvivenza di chi oggi vive in Ucraina, ma non solamente. Quindi io credo che quello che Katia ha detto ci richiama alla realtà della guerra, nella sua crudezza, nel suo dolore, nella sua sofferenza, e come da questa realtà della guerra venga quel grido di cui Giovanni XXIII diceva pace, pace, ed è il richiamare a cercare queste vie di pace nella giustizia, tenendo presente anche l'abisso, l'orlo dell'abisso. Ecco.
There were two questions I could say before. Two people that wanted to speak. One, very good.
Thank you for this opportunity given to me to ask this little question concerning the discussion we have at hand. My name is Mama Vitalis Chinedu from the part of Africa called Nigeria, from Igbo tribe. Now, with regard to all that we have heard from you people, this is a situation that from history to history, we have had a lot of times that things like this have gone on and it keeps on happening. And the experience of war, I believe, is the reason why so many countries today ended up or came up with the slogan which we hear on our daily basis, never again. Not just of that, as of the days of Shoel, I think the Russians on their own part at the same time, the fall of the Soviets brought about a lot of pains. I have read so many things that Putin said, as even how the pains caused by the fall of Soviets forced him to become a taxi driver in order to survive. From there in Nigeria at the same time, there was a war against the Igbo tribe, popularly known as Biafrans. The Shoel claimed 6 million plus, but that also over 4.something million people died. And what was the cause of all this? Either I must be in power and you follow me, or that you have got what I want and I have got what I need to take it by force. Things of this kind, in my own language, sometimes I look at them as a continuation of madness. But at the same time, we have not seen a solution so far, because the peace talk is all that we have kept on, as in even before our time, it kept on going on and on. But at the same time, we see ourselves, just like in the Matrix, ending up the same point where we are trying to run away from. Maybe there is a spirit causing all this. My little question then comes up because I remember my mother always used to tell me something. It's more like a proverb. The day we talk about how to live was supposed to be the day we think about how our death should be. It's not to have the fear not to die, because it is a necessary end one day. But at the same time, to get prepared for some things that are uncontrollable, at least within our own power as humans. We don't know the type of spirit that is creating all these things. Is there any plan at hand? Because as of now, nobody knows the quality of AI and what they can do to help humans survive this issue. If this one ends, I'm sure somewhere around another country, something like this will go on. It has continued this way. Is there any plans at hand that could help humanity, at least to save? This thing has happened, and there is something that the governments around the world have kept in place to help save life. A missile went up and something had to go there to stop it, or maybe it came down and there was something to. Is there any plan at hand? Because this is part of the concern that troubles me at the same time. Or we just have to wait and supposing something happens, we meet over there. I don't know. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. There are certainly many plans. And any government has different plans concerning their own capacity and preparation. But it's also important for you to make your own plan and to make sure that your commitment continues to grow for this world that is free of these dangers of nuclear war. I can give the floor to Martin Hellman first and then to Peter. I understand that they want to speak, or maybe Peter first and then Martin. I don't know, I can't see the... Martin, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. First of all, my heart goes out to the woman from Ukraine who spoke, and I can understand why she doesn't trust the Russians, just as I can understand why the Russians who were burned alive in the Odessa trade union building in 2014 don't trust the Ukrainians. We need to get beyond this. And to answer the question of this last person, there is a plan. In the monotheistic religions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, we are all one. There's one God. He's not ours and you guys have someone else. We're all one human family and we all need to work together. And along with this, and I'm Jewish, so I can quote the Gospels, Jesus made the point that the world is not divided into evil and good. The Russians aren't all bad, the Ukrainians all get good, or vice versa. We need to find a solution that works for all countries. And those of us on the outside, not subjected to seeing these dead children, can come at it somewhat more objectively. But my heart goes out to that woman who spoke.
Thank you, Mart. Peter.
I also wanted to address what Kate said, because it was very, very moving, and we all feel it. And that's one of the reasons why we want to stop this war immediately, so that more of this suffering doesn't go on. The wars end with negotiations. The first war of my life was the Vietnam War, the US invasion of Vietnam. When Defense Secretary Robert McNamara came to my class, he said he believed that 3.8 million Vietnamese died. Still, the Vietnamese sat down and negotiated, and we've had peace since then with Vietnam. The same thing will have to happen at the end of this war. But I'd like to see it be something more positive. And that's why I quoted that letter from Khrushchev to Kennedy. Because Khrushchev says in that letter, "From evil, some good must come." Our people have felt the burning flames of thermonuclear war. We have to eliminate every conflict between us that could cause another crisis. And from that point on, for the next year, Khrushchev and Kennedy strove together to ban the atmospheric nuclear testing as a first step to getting rid of all nuclear weapons. They strove to eliminate the space race, end wars, end the Cold War, is what Kennedy said in that American University commencement address. So this time too, we not only have to end this war, we have to do it in a way that begins the talks so that we're not polarized, the US on one side with Europe and China and Russia on the other side. That is a formula for future wars. We've got to sit down we have to speak for the planet. No leaders today speak for the planet, speak for humanity. They speak for Russia, they speak for India or China or the United States. But we have to learn the lessons again and begin to figure out how we as a planetary population can share this planet peacefully and prosperly. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I just want to make sure that Carrie doesn't want to speak. I don't see her in the things, but I wanted to thank everybody for this moment, for this occasion. And as I mentioned at the beginning when we were starting, Andrea Riccardi was 18 when he started the community of Sant'Egidio. And what we saw when the Amici painted that painting, you see acts of hopes and commitment. I think that all of us, thousands and thousands, can really engage in this conversation. This is the first time at the Prayer for Peace, and I'm sure that we will continue. Thank you all.